So for today, it is an absolute honor. Let me introduce myself first. I'm Lina Brito. I'm a professor in the Department of History. I teach modern Latin America, and I'm also Colombian and a Colombianist, and the director of graduate studies for the Latin American and Caribbean Studies program. So today, it is an absolute honor and a pleasure to be moderating this event with my dear friend and colleague and co-editor, Ricardo López-Pedreros. He is a professor of history at Western Washington University, and he's the author of Makers of Democracy, a transnational history of the middle classes in Colombia, which came out last year in 2019 with Duke University Press. And he has also been the co-editor of a volume that came out earlier, and another one that will come out next year on the middle classes, transnational histories of the middle classes. So the one that it will be coming out next year in 2021, and for whom he is a co-editor, is entitled The Middle Classes in Latin America, Subjectivities, Practices, and Genealogies, and is published by Routledge. And he is also the president of the United Faculty of Western Washington University. And today, Ricardo is going to be talking about his book on the middle classes in Colombia, and the title of this conversation is A Class That Does Not Matter, Rethinking Cold War Latin American from the Middle. So what we're going to be doing is a little different to what we usually do. So instead of having kind of like a proper lecture, Ricardo is going to be introducing his work in very general terms during 10-15 minutes. Then we're going to have a conversation. More than a conversation, is an interview. I'm going to be asking Ricardo certain questions to kind of like understand his work, where he's coming from, what are the main ideas he is reframing, and how he ended up working on this topic. And finally, we're going to open the conversation to all of you guys. So at any time, you can use the chat to type your questions. You can also use the chat to let us know that you prefer to say the question instead of typing it. And we will have that in mind. And when the Q&A is finally open, then you will be able to unmute yourself and ask the question, if that was your wish. If not, just type the question in the chat. We'll be collecting the questions. Cindy Pingre, who is one of our staff members in the program, she's going to be monitoring the chat at all times. So don't wait, just use it at any moment. You can chat with everyone. So everybody can see the question, or you can just chat with any of the hosts and co-hosts. So thanks again for all of you to being here. And now it's the turn for Ricardo López-Pedreros to introduce his amazing work, and then we start the conversation. Thank you, Ricardo, for being here. We are all ears.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lina. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this conversation. We're going to talk about the middle classes, but I want to start by thanking Professor Lina Brito for the invitation, and above all, for all the discussions about the histories of Colombia. I am indeed convinced that knowledge is produced through friendship, and I think that's indeed the case here. I also want to thank Professor Jorge Coronado and Danny Postel and all Cindy and Linda for all the work to make this presentation possible. So as Lina said, I want to do a brief presentation of the general questions that I deal with in this particular book, and then as we have the conversation / interview, I'm going to try to then be more specific about some of the arguments I make in this book. So let me start by sharing my screen right here. Everybody sees the screen? No problem? All right, good. Okay, so well, I want to start with this, two particular, pictures. Here, the one on, top is, from the white collar workers from, the main well, what would you consider, national bank, the Banco de la República in Colombia, and the particular union, and that was the moment that they were actually, fighting to, for the right to unionize in the early 1960s as white-collar workers and as middle class. The second, picture that you see there is the first, middle class Congress. Oh, apologize, I just saw, a typo there. But anyway, so the what was referred to as middle class, class Congress, and here I'm not talking about, just a conference that they were going to talk about, the middle classes. It was organized by people who identified themselves as middle class and wanted to, have a space to have a discussion about, themselves as, middle class. These two, particular pictures, became quite important, later on in my research to think about, what it meant to be, middle class. But what I'm trying to do in this particular, book is to, offer a particular history of, our globalized, present. So briefly, let me contextualize what I'm actually trying to respond to, in dialogue, with in this book. That is a, for me, that is, let's say, a political slash, theoretical slash, historical question at the core of, the book. If you go and Google, middle class democracy, you would actually, see how many, hits you would actually, get thousands and thousands of, hits. So it is a central part of, our current discussion that is often, framed as, the crisis of, democracy. So we see, all of these discourses, trying to make sense of what is often referred as, the crisis of, democracy. The response to that question about, the crisis of democracy is often, if not always, the middle class, that we need to return to a middle class society. And that actually applies to the question of the United States, or the question of, Europe, or even in Latin America. You have here, perhaps one of the, a very important book by a French sociologist, anthropologist, that actually, claim that it, the end of, the Western middle class is indeed, the crisis of democracy, and that we need to return to, that middle class, society in order to recuperate or to return to, a proper, democracy. Or there's actually, call of the neo-feudal, society, that is to say, the disappearance of the middle class and the consolidation of only two classes. That is to say, on the one hand, the elites, and on the other hand, popular groups. That is what often is referred to as the Latin Americanization of, the United States, or the Latin Americanization of, Europe. That is to say that now there are two classes, as if, these two classes are only an example of how Latin American societies, work. So then, the process of the idea works as, democratization means the creation of two classes, and democratization is the creation of one expansive middle class. What is really interesting, at least, before COVID-19, I don't know if you're familiar with COVID-19, anybody there? What we actually, see here is that before that, in Latin American societies, we see all of these studies, statistical work from the World Bank, of, state offices, making the case of, look, Latin America is, becoming more democratic because, the expansion of the, middle classes. In the Colombian case, in the middle of, the peace process of, 2016, the then, President Santos, Juan Manuel Santos, proclaimed that 50% of, Colombia population was, middle class, and that was indeed, the future of, a peaceful society. That the only, obstacle of, getting even, more democratic was indeed, the war, so that, the post-conflict society and a peaceful society would indeed consolidate by expanding that, middle class. So in that particular context, there is indeed, my argument sometimes is blackmailed. And that is to say that, okay, in a context in which neoliberalism is, dismantling, democracy by destroying middle class, why do I want to offer a critique of the middle class society? So that's, what happens here. So they, often it comes as a question as neoliberalism dismantled democracy, who doesn't want to live in a society defined by an expansive middle class? The association there, at the risk of becoming repetitive, is that democracy is associated with the expansion of middle class societies, and anti-democratization or de-democratization is with the expansion of two class society. So these are the questions that I start trying to historicize in the book. And I do that by looking at the case of Bogota in a transnational context. And the histories of Colombia then become not just a local example, but actually local example that allow us to theorize democracy in a more expansive way. So the question I asked there is just with all of this discussion about democracy and middle classness, or democracy and the formation of middle class, what definitions of democracy we often invoke, but on very few occasions specifies when we label the middle classes as anti, less, or more democratic? And more importantly for me, what was the historical process through which we came to understand the middle class as the normative foundation for the final source of what is considered a proper democracy? What is these obsessions we have that the only way we can actually think of democracy is by expanding a middle class? What does middle class mean in that particular context, right? What was the historical process that middle class society came to represent, even limit and exhaust the meanings and practices of democracy? That other definitions of democracy are now seen as unpractical, right? Like something that well, that's impossible to actually imagine a democracy other than the middle class. And as you can see, I haven't actually defined what middle class is, and I do it in my presentation on purpose, because that's precisely what I want to do, or what I do in in the book. Try to historicize what middle class mean, what democracy means as a practice, as an idea, as a political project, and then how these two are connected historically. How we end up believing that there is a link. My point here in the book is not to say whether middle classes were merely democratic or anti-democratic. My effort is to historicize why we made that connection. And after that, I try to historicize the different practices of democracy. And I do that then as a political history, an intellectual history, which there is a transnational framework, that is to say the second half of the 20th century, as part of the the development programs after World War II. So it is an intellectual history. It's a history of political economies. It's a history of policies in which this idea of middle class at the center of developing societies play a fundamental role. But it is also a social history. It's a history of those people, women and men, who identify themselves as middle class and engage themselves in major political projects to naturalize that particular link. Of course, they were able to do that because there was a context, a larger discursive context that allowed them to say middle class meant democracy. But it is indeed a social history, and that is located. The local case is Bogota, but in a transnational context. And here I must say that this is the kind of transnational history I like to do. I do not like to do transnational history that forget local histories and end up being another version of of focusing only on policymakers, right? And forget the history is grounded on I would argue, well, materiality. So at the end, then what I like to do here is to conceptualize democracy as contingent rather than preordained. At first glance, we will think like, well, that's a very obvious argument. We know that democracy is the product of political struggles. But it is indeed interesting that in almost every single work you read, democracy is often has a positive meaning. That is to say, it has become a verb. Let's democratize society. And in that particular context, we think, when we actually advocate for democratization of society, it's a positive, meaning, right? That we often put in fundamental contradiction or opposition to hierarchical rule. So what I propose in the book, by looking at discourses, collective subjectivities, and political conflicts, that is to say, social, intellectual, and political history, what I've proposed here is the multiple definitions of democracy that middle class people put forward when it comes we're actually to materialize class stratifications and gender distinctions, so that when we talk about and it is a way for us to explain the present, and that we actually say democracy and middle class right now, what we mean is a very specific form of class domination in which middle classes made that claim to dominate other societies, even the elites. And I hope I'll be able to elaborate that when we talk more in terms of the interview. So the book is at the end is a history of how multiple forms of class domination have been in a struggle over the supremacy or legitimacy of what democracy is supposed to do and deliver. And I think the middle classes have partially won that version of democracy, the connection between a specific class and gender form of domination. That is why, just to offer an example, why those who become quote unquote rich, I'm thinking about Bill Gates, for example, just to give an example. But in the case of Colombia, it's just the same. Certain people who you actually locate them as part of the elite would justify the accumulation of wealth by saying, I am part of the middle classes. We can actually engage and say, well, you are not middle class by any measure of the imagination. But we also have to ask why making that claim to middle classness seems to legitimize wealth accumulation and wealth inequality. So that's what I'm trying to historicize. At the end, my humble contribution to all of this discussion, and as you see, this I remain in this presentation at the general level, but there are specific stories about Colombia. But my humble contribution is precisely to put a question mark to the idea of long live the middle classes as answer to democracy. I put a question mark next to that particular statement, because the histories that I tell this in this book lead me to to suggest that perhaps we shouldn't actually be too quick to make that particular connection. Yeah. So at the end, it's just to see democracy as a question and not as an answer. Precisely because if we actually see as a question, then we can actually imagine a different answer to the question of democracy. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. So you know that I appreciate your work extremely, precisely because of all the things that you just have said, how you are kind of like arguing against a lot of academic consensus, but also commonsensical understandings and assumptions that we have about the middle classes as kind of like the anchor of a democratic society. And I love very much how provocative your work is, precisely because it's forcing us to think out of the box. So all these questions that we work together to produce kind of like this conversation here with everybody else are intended precisely to kind of like flesh out some of those arguments and ideas that you mentioned in your presentation briefly. So before we start like going through like each one of those arguments, why don't you tell us when and why did you decide to work on this topic, right? Because usually, or at least in my case, all ideas that I have for a scholarship are very personal, but I know that other people work in other ways. So I just wonder, in your particular case, how did you decide that this was the topic that you want to invest more than a decade of your life?
Yeah, definitely more than a decade of my life. Well, and I just want to say that, it's really, windy here in the Northwest. So hopefully, the internet, keeps working. Yeah, well, that's, I think it was Almodovar who once, remarked that, in terms of, research, in terms of what we do, what is not autobiographical is actually, plagiarism. I think that's, something that, he said, and that's the, definitely, the case for me. So my interest about, the middle classes, even if I wasn't actually thinking about, the middle classes, go back to my years as an undergrad at, Universidad Nacional de Colombia, the most important university in Colombia, isn't it? All right, no, we're not going to engage into an argument now, Lina, right? So, but as part of, let's say, my political, awakening, I do remember a particular experience that actually, at the moment, it did, stay with me, but I didn't know why. And we were in the middle of a major protest in I think it was 1995 or 1996. And I thought that, the protest was actually, getting out of hand. And I just proposed to other, what I consider class peers, right? Middle class peers, I would argue. I said, well, maybe we should actually leave. And a couple of my, peers said, well, in Spanish, I'm going to say, because actually it's quite, evident, se te salió la clase media, which means revealing, your class status by making that particular comment within the left, which I end up, historicizing that particular experience, particularly in chapter 7. Other would actually say that is, a petit bourgeoisie practice. At the moment, again, I wasn't necessarily aware, but after, so many, books and, a lot of, research, what I end up, doing is just trying to explain that what, in this particular context, what it meant to be, part of a middle class, what it meant to be part of the petit bourgeoisie, why that notion of middle class had a negative connotation in that context. That is to say, not to protest and live, that protest. So I think that was actually, one of the reasons. The other reason is, I have to say, given that, I did my PhD, my grad work here in the United States, I could actually, hear, in the popular discourse, everybody talking about, the middle classes, and in the academia, very few people before 2008 wanted to talk about, class. It was actually after 2008, with, the major economic crisis, that class, gained, let's say, some importance as a topic. So it's a combination of, personal, but also structural conditions.
In your presentation, you talk a little bit about this, but I wonder if you can dig deeper in this idea, because the first few pages of your book is kind of like a justification of why to study this subject. And in the title even of the talk today, we have that not in parentheses, a class that does not matter. So I just wonder why, if you can explain a little bit more, why you felt the need to justify this topic as a legitimate theme of historical research. Why spending so much time explaining why we should study the middle classes?
Well, I think, there are, several, reasons. The first one is just, I definitely want, a broad readership for the book. So I thought that, this would actually, speak to some, questions that are part of, histories of Colombia, historiographies, Latin American historiography. So, that's part of, the problem. And also, of course, because of, what I consider is the common sense of our present. But the other part is also as a response to a lot of questions that I got as I was actually working on this. And it's just, and I didn't mention this in my presentation, and it's the idea that in order to understand, domination and power relationships, you have to focus on the two main, classes, or what is perceived the two main classes. And those are, of course, popular groups and, elites. Latin American historiography have actually been shaped by that particular, tendency there. So there is, a very strong assumption that the authentic and even unique struggle is the one defined by, these two classes. So when we talk about the middle classes, then we assume that there is something else. It's a way to avoid what is perceived the main question. But what I propose is that when we study the middle classes, we are also talking about a different and perhaps equally important form of domination. It is to put the middle classes, the formation of the middle classes, to understand the second half of the 20th century in Colombia and in Latin America, particularly what we perceive as the Cold War. But there is also an aspect that for me was really difficult to deal with, and that is that I would argue that the academia, particularly in the United States, is now defined by, well, what is often referred to as decolonial theories, subaltern studies. And I have to say, and this is something that we have to do a little bit more research about, but those topics do sell. The study of the middle classes do not. So I have to respond to that. And I have a clear idea as to why the middle classes do not sell, because it may well be the case that we as part of the academia reveal ourselves as part of that class and all of these projects of domination that I'm discussing. So I had to actually respond to, on so many occasions, well, like who cares about the middle classes? That was indeed so that's the title there. A class that does not matter is a claim on my part that it actually matters, and it matters a lot, not just to recuperate the stories of the middle classes, but actually the way how we can explain domination, how domination works, how power works, from the middle.
Okay, but it's also, so what you're saying is you needed to justify it because usually like traditional frameworks only pay attention to either elites or subaltern sectors. Mm-hmm. So therefore you needed kind of like to explain why you study history from the middle. Yeah. But isn't it also because defining what the middle class is complicated and very volatile? You yourself in your presentation, you said that you were not defining what you meant by the term, but you do something very interesting. Instead of talking about the middle class, you talk about the middle classes. So why the plural, and what exactly are the social sectors in Colombia that you are referring to with this concept in plural?
And that's actually, that was a process. One of the things that I did, first, particular for, the dissertation, was to focus on, professionals. And then, I expanded, this to include white-collar workers, both in state offices and, private offices, and, small business owners. So what I mean in the book, in terms of, sociological, description, three groups: professionals, given the expansion of the state and expansion of, education, the white-collar workers as a product of, the expansion of the service sector. And for me, that is, a key, group. And then small business owners. In the Colombian case, the small business owners are a very interesting, group to understand, the consolidation of neoliberalism. But that, will be a discussion for later. So the way I define, these middle classes in plural are, the product of structural, conditions. What are those conditions? The expansion of the state, particularly with the developmental, programs that actually materialize the professionalization of, or the expansion of education that will translate into the professionalization of, social relationships, the expansion of the service sector. And what I mean by that is, working in offices, private and public offices. And then the expansion of, industrialization, which translated into, the consolidation of a small, business or small, industries that are going to actually, consolidate identities as small business owners. So the way I see, I define, the middle classes here is what, René Zabaleta Mercado, the Bolivian intellectual, has a concept, which is, the translation is not, I think, proper here, but it's, the notion of abirraigado, right? So that's, that's the way I understand, the middle classes, that actually, give us the possibility to talk about the heterogeneity of the middle classes. But at the same time, I made the case that, precisely because of this heterogeneity, we can also talk about, certain level of, similarity and the role of gender, plays a fundamental role, there. So I'm trying to, talk to, the heterogeneity or the abirraigado, which is, translated as, motley, or that then is going to translate into, shared political projects, even if for each, group, different ideas of middle class also were at work. So these are, the three main groups.
So basically, it's kind of like an umbrella concept that cannot be kind of like anchored in a particular group or moment in time, because it's fluid and like just kind of like changes depending on what time, what moment in time we're talking about, right?
Yes.
So along those lines, we have seen processes of formation and consolidation of middle classes in different parts of Latin America, in like the largest economies and countries such as Brazil or Mexico or Argentina. We can talk about the middle classes since the first half of the 20th century. But in the case that you're making for Colombia, you're saying is the second half of the 20th century, and you actually frame it in like the period of the Cold War as the key moment in time when we have a process of formation and consolidation of middle classes, particularly the 60s and the 70s. So what it's like, can you explain kind of like this periodization better, and what exactly is the contribution that what Colombia, the case of Colombia in the second half of the 20th century has to teach us? We, scholars and academics working with a Latin American perspective, or like people interested in understanding Latin America, what the case of Colombia can teach us when we, comparatively speaking, is kind of like a late case in the Latin American context.
That's indeed, very difficult question, but a very important one, Dina. And I would say, as part of, the co-edited, volume that I am, working on, one of the things that we are trying, to do is to reframe that, periodization. And what, one of the things that we are trying to do that even, second half of the, 19th century, we see the formation of, middle classes. And what we see is, the connection of that identity with specific social groups. So in the case of Colombia, for example, late 19th century, we see, artisans making that claim to a middle class identity. But that also, was also, happening in the Mexican case. But of course, Mexico had, the revolution of early, 20th century. So they're simultaneously, processed. The difference is the connection between social groups and a middle class identity. My earlier, work on, the middle classes is actually, about the first half of, the 20th century. And there, public employees were associated with a middle class identities. Professionals were not seen as part of, middle class. They were, seen as part of, the elites. So one of the things that we have to historicize is precisely who get, to see, or who get, the right to claim, themselves as part of, the middle classes. Interestingly enough, one of the things that we see with, the latest work on the formation of the middle classes, for example, in Argentina, that for a while we thought was indeed, along with Uruguay, it was indeed, the representation of middle classness. But some of what, historians have shown that is actually, in comparison to other places, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, for example, the very notion of middle class came quite late to Argentina, and it was only possible as a response to Peronism. So we're talking about the 1940s and 1950s, with that idea and that, practice actually, materialized in the Argentine case. There are some specificities, however, that actually, materialized in the second half of, the 20th century. And then we see more of a, homogeneous movement throughout Latin America. And that is, developmental programs that are not necessarily new, but the idea of creating an urban middle class are going to actually, be a central part of these, social policies throughout, the region. And that's going to actually apply to most of, Latin American nations. So there are some specificities to the first, part of, the 20th century, but for the second half of the 20th century, we see some more, homogeneous process. And that homogeneous process is actually, possible because the obsession of intellectuals in the Americas, throughout the Americas, policymakers, throughout the Americas, to make the connection between middle class and democracy. That, obsession was the product of what was perceived as the consolidation of populism in the case of Argentina, the La Violencia, the 1950s, in the Colombian case, the Cuban Revolution of 1959. As a response to those events, these policies are going to say, well, the only possibility we have in this particular case is to create a middle class society in order to create, democracy. But of course, the policymakers were soon, disappointed, because at first they saw, well, you have Fidel Castro, a lawyer, the representation of this professional middle class. He is going to bring, democracy to, Cuba. But once, the revolution happened, they started creating this idea of the middle classes in Latin America as what I call in the book, bastard middle classes, the illegitimate middle classes in Latin America. But that was because the middle classes had a more of a political element in comparison to what these policymakers saw the case of Europe or, the United States.
So you're saying, like, okay, so La Violencia, which is a conflict between the two main political parties in Colombia, liberals and conservatives, and obviously their followers, clienteles, and members of the parties, that happened between the late 1940s and early 1950s, was absolutely crucial to this new cycle of thinking the middle classes as a hemispheric historical process for the Americas, right? So kind of like Colombia being there in a central position for that transnational conversation that was happening at the time. So if that was the context in Colombia, this conflict that happened in the late 40s, early 50s, and then brief dictatorship, and then the National Front, which is a political pact between the leaders of these two political parties to stop the war, the conflict, and share the state apparatus and the presidency for the next 2 decades, well, 16 years, right? So if that was the context in which this new understanding of the middle class came about, what were those other alternatives of democracy that you found there that this very narrow and limited understanding of democracy with the middle classes at the center was kind of like eclipsing and obscuring? What were the alternatives? Because I'm just being like a devil's advocate a little. Do you think sometimes your criticism is a little too harsh? I mean, what was there? What were the alternatives?
Okay, no, that's this, and I wish I could actually, talk more specifically how, what I'm gonna, mention in terms of what the alternative of, a radical petit bourgeoisie was the product of. But I'm going to say, a couple of things, because I did not answer, the previous question in terms of what do we learn from, histories of, Colombia in relationship to talk about, the Cold War. But one of the, the thing that I think we can actually learn from the histories of Colombia is, to understand, democracy in a different way. And I want to be as clear as I can. My point is not to say that unlike other places in Latin America, Colombia had, the oldest, well, at least, formally speaking, democracy. That is not my point. Far from it. But what I want to ask, to see is that when we historicize, democracy, we may actually, put democracy and dictatorial rule, right? Or historicize the link between these two, because the link that made, possible that connection of, the middle classes, the idea of the middle classes made that connection possible. So when we, study the histories of the, democracy in the Colombian case, would allow us to perhaps, what's the word? Diversify, the histories of the Cold War, because too often, we see, the Cold War as a consolidation of dictatorial rule, and that is indeed, the case. but how we actually, talk about the cases of Mexico that formerly remain, a democracy, the case of, Costa Rica, the case of, Venezuela, the case of, Colombia. So then you actually say, well, democracy, you celebrate democracy, and then you have all the other cases about, dictatorial rule. But when you actually, see that one of the ways to justify, democracy and dictatorial rule was to create a middle class, then we have a different kind of, a narrative. Now, the question about, alternative form of, democracies. These alternative forms of democracies did indeed, depend on the national front. There is a larger argument here that I want to make that, perhaps one of the most powerful historiographical arguments, particularly right now in Colombia, is that, the radicalization of, society was the product, or was rather, the product of, the exclusionary measures by the national front. But when we actually see the national front as a question of development, that argument, I have to say, is only partially right, because these professionals who became radicalized as part of the left became radicalized as they started working with the developmental state. So radicalization happened within the national front, not outside of, against the national, front. In that context, what we actually, see is, and I have to say that, here, I don't think my critique is a little bit harsh, because at the end of the day, what I want to, want to do is to reclaim, to reivindicar the role of petit bourgeoisie in their effort to redefine, democracy. Just to mention some elements, the production of knowledge, for example, of the 1960s and 1970s. The colonial theories have some middle class elements in that production, right? Subaltern studies have some elements of, in terms of this middle class, identity of the 1960s and 1970s. So that's and in particular in the case of Colombia, with, fast border, investigación, acción participativa has some, class element, that is to say a middle class, project that wanted to expand knowledge production and use knowledge production to, to criticize the status quo. They made the claim of, health as a fundamental right against the idea that was already consolidating itself, particularly the late 1970s with, López Michelsen and Turbay Ayala, in which, health would actually, become an, individual purchase rather than, a right. These middle classes, the radical middle classes, also talk about, economic success as a collective endeavor instead of an individual, entrepreneurial, effort. They also talk about, land distribution. All of these professionals work with, peasant organizations and produce very interesting, knowledge production that is going to actually be appropriated by, other groups and going to be seen as, the production of, Europe and the United States. They also question the national front and the oligarchical, elites. So there is a major, effort to redefine, democracy in a context in which a first, let's say, example of neoliberalization of society was taking place. But I also have to say that as part of that, effort, particularly men made the claim as petit bourgeoisie men that they had the right to rule over others, over popular groups and elites. And it's in that particular context that then, we actually see how that, claim in an unintended way open the possibility that neoliberal, rule will consolidate itself, because at the core of neoliberal rule, late 1970s and early 1980s, because things would actually change in the 1980s in Colombia, that was going to actually, give some level of legitimacy to the first examples of neoliberalization of society in Bogota, and I would argue in, Colombia. That shared value among, petit bourgeoisie men, that it was up to them how to dominate or, make the claim to the right to rule others in society. So that's the, rather than seeing as a critique, I would actually say that, it's a major contradiction at the core of this, more radical version of, democracy that some of the professional white collar workers and small business, people put forward.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm most fascinated about your work. That idea that radicalization did not happen against the National Front, but within the National Front, as a result of the lived experience of these men and women working in developmental programs. That's one thing. And the other thing that is completely intertwined with this argument, which I also found incredibly interesting and provocative, precisely because it's so dense, there's so much to think about there, is this idea that middle classes had been considered non-political actors, right? They either joined reactionary forces in reactionary elites, or they either joined revolutionary, radical, working class, peasant politics. But they themselves, as a class, they don't have a political project. Therefore, they're not political actors, and therefore, that's why they should be the anchor or the foundation of a democratic society that is free of class conflicts, right? But you completely argue against that. And I love the way you do it. And all those of you guys who haven't got the book or like read it, like I really recommend it in the whole book, but those chapters are just absolutely fantastic and phenomenal. So just to one last question about this, so we can open the Q&A to everybody and see what other questions they have about sources, methodologies, etc. But I'm just going to add one more question and then we go to the audience, and that is about gender. For you to argue against this idea of the middle classes as non-political actors, and for you to demonstrate that they actually had a political project of their own, and in that political project, they gave themselves the right to rule the country, or at least ideally, and to impose the rule over working classes and over elites as well. You use a gender perspective in order kind of to understand how that happens. So can you tell us more about how you use gender as a category of historical analysis, and also why has been so controversial the way you did that, and why you think it hit so hard, why so many people reacted like not very happily against this use of gender in your discussion about the radicalization of the middle classes and the middle classes as political actors?
Yes, the question of gender for me is absolutely, critical as part of, the, let's say, the academic consensus about, the lack of a political project. One of the ideas is that, the middle classes are too heterogeneous to have a shared, political, project. But when you think about the questions of gender, and particularly, the notions of masculinity, there is a shared project. Men did, share that, political, claim to the right to rule. Both, for those was, just to be brief, more conservative middle classes and, the more radical ones. Both, despite that they actually, have a completely, different, political project, they did, share as men that, that claim. Now, women did indeed, participate, as well as middle class women. But in this particular case, it was indeed, the notion of masculinity is going to actually give some, coherence to, the middle class as a class. So that's, part why, I think gender play a fundamental role in this, particular case. And it is that part that I would say, bothers some of, the readers, particularly those who, find themselves in that argument, those people who are from that particular, generation. They would actually, say like, well, we had, a political project that was intimately associated with, the popular classes. And I say, absolutely, but you also make the claim to represent those popular classes. I'm simplifying, the argument here because I cannot go into the details, but that's at the core of a middle class, project as well. So the reason as to why I like, to think that, these arguments hit hard, as you call it, Lina, is because, some middle class men in particular find themselves in that argument, historically speaking. And the way how, most of these, professionals and, white collars in particular deal with that, situation is by saying, no, we are not, we do not have a middle class. identity is too heterogeneous. It's a way to deny the role of power that the middle classes could actually have. But that, I think that's one of the main reasons. There are other reasons as well, but I think that's actually one of the main reasons as to why that part of the argument levantar pollas, perhaps.
So okay, let's see if anybody wants to chime in with a comment, question. You guys can use the chat. I think at this point, all of you are allowed to unmute yourself. So you can use the raised hand function in your chat, and just let me know that you have a question that you wanna speak instead of typing it. Or if you feel more comfortable just typing it, you can do that. And then Cindy or even myself, we read it for you. So let's see if anybody wants to chime in.
Okay, I have a question from Gloria. She says, can you expand on the importance of education to the identity of the middle class and their social mobility? Is there an idea of a self-made woman and men and an idea of mediocrity? In the archive you used, did you find discourses about the importance of public-private education or the importance of reading or studying?
Okay, are we gonna get several questions at once, or we wanna do one by one?
Do you want to just go ahead and answer that one?
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's do one by one.
Yeah, all right, absolutely. So yes, the notion of the self-made person is at the core of a notion of middle class identity, and the notion of education, and it did provide possibilities for social mobility. One of the things that I do in the book is to offer an ethnography, partially through oral histories, but also through personal archive, private archive. One of the things that is for me very, very interesting is that we often see the Alliance for Progress, which is at the center of the developmental programs of the 1960s. We usually see the Alliance for Progress as a failure. It did not work, right? One of the things I try to show is that actually did work, because it did want to create a middle class society, and it did indeed empower women and men and provide the material possibility to experience a level of social mobility. Interestingly enough, particularly for women, because it did open, or actually not necessarily open, but expand job possibilities to work for the developmental state. That's actually a key part, and also to work for in office work. Expand the participation of women. At the center of that possibility, the notion of self-made women, entrepreneurial women was key, right? The individualization of social mobility. So yes, at first in the early 1960s, that was indeed the case. But as I was trying to argue later, we're going to see a shift by the late 1960s and early 1970s, because some of those women are going to be radicalized precisely because women would actually face the other, either the elites or the popular groups, and it was the product of that class encounter. They're going to radicalize some professionals, and they're going to start question even the notion of social mobility, and imagine a different kind of definition of democracy, as I tried to describe earlier. And then in the 1970s, with new policies about neoliberalism, that notion of self-made person is going to again get some support from women and men in order to experience a level of social mobility. But yeah, I do think that the Alliance for Progress as a developmental program materialize those opportunities for social mobility.
I know that Jorge has a question. So Jorge, go ahead and mute yourself, and then we go with another question from Diego that is in the chat, Cindy. Thank you. Go ahead, Jorge.
Ricardo, thank you so much for your talk. Through the magic of Cheerios, I am keeping the small child quiet for the moment. We'll see how long that lasts. I wanted to first just chime in to say I'm entirely in agreement. I think it is really difficult or it's apremiante to study gender and race at the intersection of class. I think one of the things that's perhaps regretful about some scholarship now is that it tends to focus on race or gender at the absence of class. That is to say, there's no triangulation there, and that always seems to me to be problematic for understanding a given national case, society, literature, right, more completely. So with that frame, I wanted to ask about your reading of masculinity, right, to kind of align it with other shared, political projects, perhaps in quotes. One that I could think of in terms of a middle class in all Latin America would be consumption, right? When I think middle class in Latin America, I think about the ways in which, whatever we want to call that class or classes, right, defined itself in terms of its power of acquisition, right, at different moments. And I wanted to know if you had identified this, if this was a possibility, right? And if you want to think more broadly, right, how this intersects with questions of race, which I think is absolutely crucial. Rightening, for example, right, could also be thought of as a political project. Thank you. I'm gonna mute this.
All right. Thank you, Jorge. And I also see the question from Diego, which is in relation to what Jorge just said in terms of the racial ideology. So I can combine both in my answer. So yes, consumption has been a central part of a middle class identity. But I make an argument in the book to, let's say, shift this assumption. And the reason I do this is because most studies on the middle class have indeed focused on the question of consumption. So I said, sometimes we make the assumption here: consumption, middle classes; labor, working classes. And what I want to do in this, the book, particularly in chapter 3 and in the second half of the book, is to say middle classes, labor, and see the question of middle class formation as a question of labor. So that's the way that's why and just because I think historiographically speaking that a lot of studies on the question of consumption. What is interesting for me, the question of consumption, is that other classes also exercise consumption. So what is middle class about that particular consumption? And in this particular case, I would argue that as I said in chapter 8, the notion of debt became associated with the possibility to consume and become associated with the neoliberalization of society. That in the 1970s was seen as middle classness, those who are able or capable to have more economic power to get in debt, to consume houses, to celebrate the notion of private property as an individual endeavor. But then this particular idea is going to be, let's say, popularized. I do not think that in the 1980s I would argue that idea is going to be popularized. If you think for anybody from Colombia, when the idea of the casita roja de la vivienda is indeed a reference to consumption as the right to belong to a society, or the right to belong to a nation, and a notion of citizenship. But at first, there was a connection between consumption, debt, and citizenship with a notion of middle class. The question of race, on the other hand, is indeed difficult. So I have a confession to make, and then I will answer the question. The confession is this: I wanted to finish the book, so I decided not to include I mean, there are some aspects about race, and it's something that I'm working on right now. So I have plenty to say, but I made the decision, okay, if I wanted to finish this book, I definitely have to sacrifice, and that was indeed what I had to do, to sacrifice. But the question of race was so central in three important ways. The first one is the notion of mestizaje, which is so central to, Latin American societies. The idea of the middle, in terms of, creating a class harmony in the 1950s and 1960s, right? Again, as a response to, violent conflict, the notion of middle class is going to emerge as like overcoming that, violent conflict. But that was intimately accompanied by the idea of mestizaje as a way to create a racially harmonious, society. So, these are going to be, connected. But, Diego here also asked an interesting, question, which is, who get to be included into the middle classes as a question of, race. So that's the second part, because, the middle classes in Colombia were also regionalized. There were two, parts of, Colombia who made the claim to a proper belonging to the middle class. Bogota as a capital, of course, and mostly as a, mestizo society that would indeed, be able to, belong to a middle class. And then, Antioquia, who actually, made, the case that they were indeed the representation of a middle class society, not only in comparison to other places in Latin America, but in comparison to other, places in Latin America. But there, it was the notion of whiteness, not necessarily the notion of, mestizaje. The work by, Mara Viveros actually shows that, being Black was perceived as a fundamental contradiction of being middle class. So the moment that you would become middle class, it was like, your racial identity had to actually, disappear. So there are, three aspects. And of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that there were not, Black middle classes, right? But the notion of proper middle class there would indeed, mean that, you could not be Black and middle class. It was read as a contradiction. So on the one hand, Russia, the notion of mestizaje as a way to celebrate, racial harmony and class harmony. But on the other, particularly, for those who are able to get jobs in the developmental state, race play a fundamental role. Some, people who, particularly teachers, because, people coming from, the Chocó region, again, the notion of regionalization is quite important. As they, moved to Bogota in the 1950s and 1960s, most of them became teachers. And some of them were not able to, quote, unquote, represent the state precisely because of a regional identity that often was present to rational, identity. So the notion of social mobility that I mentioned earlier has some very important racial, elements as well that exclude, both in terms of discourse and identity, the notion of middle classness for those, people who were, who wanted to claim a middle classness. Things are going to change, as Mara Viveros shows, with, the emergence of multiculturalism in the neoliberal, era. That's going to actually open up the possibility to talk about Black middle classes, particularly in Colombia.
Thank you, Ricardo. Anybody else?
I have a quick follow-up. Just
Go ahead.
To say thank you so much for the response. And I wanted to say that you mentioned Zabaleta Mercado before, and I think you're spot on. I mean, I think there's, in terms of what you're just describing with respect to race, it seems to me that abigarramiento as la sociedad abigarrada, right, as a notion focuses on these conflictual, right, relationships or dynamics and the ways in which they drive, right, historical change, right? So I think, in thinking about race especially, that's a very useful term, right, to think about the sorts of dynamics you're talking about.
Yeah, and the way I see it, and I have to say that I started reading more carefully Zabaleta Mercado after I finished this book. So now for the book that I'm co-editing, it's becoming a central part, because one of the things that one of the reasons as to why we often work on the idea that there is no middle class identity consciousness, a political project, is because we assume the structural conditions. That is to say, and I have to say, it's influenced by, by Marx, or Marxism rather, and the idea that, it is all about industrialization. So if it is about industrialization, then there is no space to talk about, workers in offices or professionals or, small business owners. They either, join the elites or join, the working classes, because that's the structural condition in place. But if we actually, see, as, Zabaleta Mercado, this abigarramiento that is, let's say, my appropriation of, his concept, that is that we have multiple structural conditions. If we see the 20th century, the expansion of, the service sector, people working in offices, that doesn't mean that, there are no workers working in factories, of course, people working in the fields. But this is indeed, the abigarramiento. There are different structural conditions. That is not just one unique class struggle. So when we actually see, then my argument is that there are some structural conditions, that the middle classes is not just, because some people one day they say, I want to be, middle class. And there is, it's a very, how to put it, for me, a postmodern, quote unquote, neoliberal understanding of, class, formation. It's like, whatever people want you to say about who they are, it goes. No, there are some structural conditions in place. And those structural conditions had to do with, let's say, new economic, processes. One of them, the expansion of, small businesses, and the other one, the expansion of, the service sector as a question of, labor. So Zabaleta Mercado has become a, very important, thinker for me in order to make my, my case for those who actually say that Latin America, that, the middle classes do not exist in Latin America.
Thank you, Ricardo. Anybody else wants to speak your question? Because I don't see anything else here in the chat. Cindy, do you have any other question just sent privately to you? Okay, let's see if anybody else, just unmute yourself and jump in. All right, so I do have one more question. What you were talking about, actually, about, this, in your book, you trace several transitions, right? Like, to be simple, hopefully not simplistic, the first one is kind of like that transition from like industrialization to a service sector, service economy, right? And then, but then by the end of your book, in the last chapters, you kind of like arrive to a very provocative conclusion that it has to do with a second historical transition. And that will be kind of like from like that service economy to a neoliberal economy. And you actually suggest something very provocative, saying that kind of like the middle classes were the historical agents that brought about or created the conditions for that neoliberal turn that happened in the 1980s and 1990s, that it was not just the elites or foreign actors, as usually is framed, right? Like neoliberal reforms coming from either elites or like a foreign interest. But here you are locating the middle classes as the historical agents that produce the conditions for this historical transition from a service economy to a neoliberal one. So how do you arrive to that realization? And can you tell us more about your argument in that respect? Because I know some people here are working within the context of the neoliberal reforms or are examining neoliberalism more specifically, or the subjects, their topics of research had to do with the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, when we see the neoliberal reforms coming to fruition.
Yes, I think that, let me put it this way. So from the left, we said, neoliberalism, destroyed, society. And from the right, you would actually say, well, neoliberalism, improved, society. But sometimes we do not actually, explain how neoliberalism, work. And we have this obsession to give so much power to the elites. So, the elite themselves, like, well, the neoliberalism was a creation of the elites. And then how did they actually get away with so much? Of course, the role of violence play a fundamental role. And that's definitely the case. But small business owners, and the group in Colombia is called ACOPI, right? Made me redefine that particular assumption, because you read in comparison to the industrialists, right, from Medellin in particular. And then, you read, the ACOPI publications, the small business owners. the small business owners are making the claim for, the neoliberalization, or what we now see the neoliberalization of, the economy. The industrialists would actually say, no, let's not do that. Let's protect, the national, economy, as they used to say. So that, hey, wait a minute. So, the elites were partially against, neoliberalism. So that was what, actually, got me thinking about this. But I do, and it's actually something I'm working on right now, but I do, a couple of things in the book, the, latter part of the book. The first one is that neoliberal policies emerged not just because, the elites knew from the very beginning they had to do that. It was a response to the politicization of the middle classes and the radicalization of the petit bourgeoisie. The elites were terrified that the middle classes, where all of these participated in political protests and everything else. So the 1970s, we actually see how the elites responded to the participation of physicians in the 1977 national strike, right? Professionals, in general, small business owners and white-collar workers. The response from the elites was like, we have to do something. Oh, popular groups, of course, they can actually participate. They're always being so politicized, but the middle classes, as a response to that, and this is actually 1970s, in the decade, they're going to say, we have to give something. I'm just simplifying the argument here, but we have to give something to the middle classes. And what they gave them was precisely the UPAC. And the UPAC, which is was a way to open up opportunities to own houses and legitimize home ownership. A political call, or a political request by middle classes since the late 1960s. That other ways, other forms that the state and the elites are going to respond to some of the middle class demands. So it is as a response to that that the elites are thinking about, well, this neoliberal, or what was called at the moment neoclassical political economics, they're going to actually increment those policies, and did a lot of political work to materialize support and legitimacy to that political program among middle classes, or among a specific sector of the middle classes. So neoliberalism was not just a creation of the elites, but rather a project that went way beyond the elites. Veronica Gago has a very interesting book called Neoliberalism from Below. And I would actually say, well, try to do neoliberalism from the middle. But the project that I'm working on right now is to historicize the social foundations of neoliberalism. And in order to do that, we have to see neoliberalism as a political economy, absolutely, but a political economy that has actually, very real practices in which, people engage, appropriate, reject, sometimes all at once, about what is, proposed, to them. You asked me, I think the Constitution of 1991 in Colombia is indeed, the contradictions of a neoliberal rule in, Latin America, because it had some very progressive elements, but all of them are going to be shaped by a notion of what I would, call a neoliberal, subject. In very few terms is the idea of the entrepreneurial self, and that's going to be appropriated by, Black communities, indigenous groups, and in appropriating that, they're going to redefine that entrepreneurial self, but it's going to actually legitimize a neoliberal rule. Well, particularly in the 1990s. So it is a call for, to talk about, to historicize the social foundations of neoliberalism rather than, take it for, for granted.
Thank you, Ricardo. Just for those of you who are not Colombian or Colombianist, the UPAC, it was kind of like a financial service and at the same time a financial unit to liberalize the mortgage market. And obviously kind of like redistribute state and private resources for the acquisition of housing. But Cindy, I think you said that you have a question?
Yes. Questions that came to me privately. So Christian wants to know about the archive that you used for your research And for instance, what cultural reference used these middle classes in Colombia to identify themselves as such? And what kind of materials did you consult?
Okay, so well, I have to say that I did a lot of archival, work. I did, a lot, and that was actually, it became an obsession precisely because, this idea that the middle classes didn't exist. So it became, well, and of course that, only late in the process, I found what we actually consider a middle class archive. So I work with, what I consider transnational archives. The NARA, the National Archives in the United States. I work with, international institutions like, the Organization of American States, the John F. Kennedy Library, transnational archives, right? So I also work in the state archives where, people work. I also work with, private companies archive where also, people, work. And also, work with a archive from political organizations, middle class, political organizations that call themselves, middle class. I also work with, which is actually, one of the things that I enjoy the most, but, personal archives. And it's just the personal archives are, papers that, people, kept in their own, homes, their own, closets. And then you would actually, find, from page stubs to, diaries, right? So I, that's the other archival source that I use, and then I have what I would consider an extensive ethnographic work. I did a lot of oral histories, and I did it not just to recuperate or reclaim the role of the middle classes, but try to understand why people think the way they do. I came to this topic with very particular stereotypes about the middle classes, but with doing ethnographic work, this ethnographic work challenged me to think more complicated ways, the subjectivities, right? That is not just because people are just stupid and they believe in things I don't believe, right? But I try to understand why they think the way they do, and in particular, this very powerful idea that they represent democracy. I start with the story of a professional who actually wrote up poems and writings and everything as part of our ethnographic work, and said middle class means democracy. He was actually citing Barrington Moore. No bourgeoisie, no democracy. But he said no middle class, no democracy. And instead of saying, well, you're stupid, you have no idea what democracy means, I started thinking about why you think the way you do. And we engaged in very difficult conversations in some cases. There are other stories at the final chapter in which I had to do ethnographic or interviews with people who did participate on torture in order to defend their middle class status. That were very difficult conversations. So I have let's say an ample repertoire of sources, but I would actually say that that the ethnographic or oral histories are the key part of the book.
Thank you, Ricardo. So our time is going to be up pretty soon, and we have two more questions. One is Usdin. He wants to do it in person, so we're going to do that in a minute. And in the chat, we have one from Elsa okay, and also Laura. Let's see if we can kind of combine all of them and give us a brilliant answer for all of them at the same time, please. So the first one is from Elsa that says, did the middle classes get inspiration from abroad, and from whom in their vision / creation for the Colombian state? And then Laura, she says, I have a sense that the importance of class cleavages has changed over time in electoral politics. Could you talk a bit about this? And then Usdin, just unmute yourself and see how Ricardo can combine these different things and give us an answer. Go ahead, Usdin.
Thank you, Lina. Hi, Ricardo, and thank you for your talk. I'll try to be very brief. And actually wanted for you to go back to the beginning of your presentation, maybe the transnational element of it, and especially the way you're situating your critique around discourses of the crisis of democracy. So just if you want to, I really like the way your project is set against the idea that the middle classes are the response to this crisis. But I want to know in what way this critical history of the middle classes that has this transnational component can inform maybe other diagnoses or put that idea of crisis in question, or maybe have like a different insight on it, even if you disagree that this is the answer to that kind of problem. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I only have 5 minutes to answer all of those questions, right? Okay, so let me start with the last one. The transnational aspect. There is a methodological question there and a political one. The methodological question I think is important to me is that I do transnational history, but I do the transnational history in the way I like it, which means that transnational history has, for me, has nothing to do with geographical coverage. It doesn't mean that we have to cover everything at expense of what I would consider the dense histories of social relationships. And what I mean by that is that now we have this tendency in Latin American historiographies to recuperate the role of Latin America. So we have recent studies talking about, well, Latin America participated in the creation of development. It was not an imperial imposition, right? That is true, right? But in that effort, we celebrate Latin America, however defined, and sometimes accept the question of power. For me, transnational history has to do with how you approach a historical problematization and look at from different perspective in a transnational context, and then how that transnational context applies to local case. So that allowed me to in a minute give the answer to Elsa. In that particular sense, Austin, what is the problem that I have here, or the problematization rather, the connection between democracy and middle class. So in that sense, methodologically speaking, I like my work to be read by not only Colombianists or Latin Americanists, but also by Americanists. Is that the way they call them themselves? Americanists. Well, all of these terms. Anyway, and see that they can actually deprovincialize their own histories too. That's the only way we can actually go beyond what I consider a tired argument, which is all these stories were Eurocentric. And let me show you the perspective from Latin America, from Africa, from the places outside what is considered Europe or the United States. We have to explain, historically speaking, why we came to believe, in this particular case, that Europe and the United States represented democracy, instead of merely saying that it's Eurocentric. So that's the aspect of transnational history allow us to do, to write histories of empire that are not imperialistic. That's the distinction I make. And how I do it, I take that particular historical problematization. I try to historicize how the connection between middle class and democracy came to be, and how that informed what was going on in particularly Bogota, but also part of my larger research, other places like Medellin or Cali. So that's the way how to do it. So to answer Elsa's question in that sense is that yes, it was actually informed by this transnational context, something I couldn't do. Again, a confession, because I wanted to finish my my work. My book was to see the influence or the connection, the transnational connections between middle class formations in Bogota and other places in Latin America, how they inform each other, and how they also inform the formation of the middle classes in the United States. And you will actually see the radicalization of the 1970s are in intimate connection to what's going on in the United States. But there is no, let's say, these are more important than others. But there was actually a connection. In particular, the question of knowledge production, right? Interesting enough, imperial politics are going to play a role there. That is to say that the appropriation by middle class intellectuals and professionals of what was going on in Latin America, it's going to actually be seen as a production in the United States and not as a production of Latin America. So there are definitely, you know, some, you know, connections there. The notion of the American dream is indeed, you know, something associated, you know, that at some point it was, of course, associated with the middle class, you know, formation. The last question, but, you know, Laura, I must confirm, I'm not clear about what, you know, Laura is asking me here. Is just, you know, the role of, you know, middle classes over, you know, time in electoral politics. I assume that it's just, you know, the middle classes, if Laura or Laura can, you know, provide a little bit more context there very quickly, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just thinking about the use of the term middle classes and the use of the terms, how they are displayed over time. And I think you're right that it's mostly about the popular classes versus the elites. And I was wondering if you have found instances in which within electoral politics, the term that you rightly say that is kind of missing was kind of more relevant than in other contexts.
Okay. Oh, that's okay. You know, that's a really good, you know, good question, because yes, you know, the middle classes often tend to appear as the, you know, class that in, you know, the moment of electoral, you know, struggles, you know, appear. So, for example, in the case of Lopez Mikkelsen, the notion of, you know, the middle classes was all over, you know, the place. Some historians read that like, you know, anti-rhetoric, but as I, you know, it is actually clear now, it has some, you know, material purchase, a political, you know, purchase there. When, you know, Lopez Mikkelsen, you know, imagined Colombia as the next, you know, Japan, right? It was because they wanted to, you know, to see, you know, the middle classes. Turbay Ayala would consider himself as, you know, the example of social mobility and, you know, middle class identity. And, you know, he specifically spoke to middle class organizations. So in the moment of, you know, electoral politics, the middle classes, you know, appear as sometimes, you know, the central, you know, role, you know, there. What we have to historicize is at what extent, you know, that, you know, rhetoric, you know, translate into, you know, particular political practices. He also, you know, appears with, you know, Álvaro Uribe Vélez. I don't know if we remember that guy. I don't like to invoke him, but I have to, right? So in this, you know, particular case, if you see the very first, you know, so-called democratic manifesto by Uribe Vélez, you know, the middle classes were there. And again, I have to invoke, just to, you know, prove my point, you know, a guy that I, of course, do not like, and I don't like, you know, to, you know, refer to, but, you know, Castaño, the guy from, you know, the paramilitary, you know, groups, Carlos Castaño, he would actually say that, you know, the formation of the paramilitary groups was up, you know, the armed response by middle class, you know, people. So it is at the core of all of the, you know, these discussions. Again, historians and, you know, the most important philosophers, you know, here I'm talking about Zizek and all of these people who produce, you know, book every other, you know, month. They actually, you know, see the middle class as a myth or as the lie of, you know, power. It's something that is, you know, put us in a different place. But I actually, you know, see that, you know, at the core of those, you know, discourses, we are discussing, you know, the potential redefinitions of, you know, democracy. And, you know, as part of that, you know, electoral politics play a fundamental role.
And also in your book, chapter 6 and 7, Laura, talks about the ANAPO, right? And how, like, you know, this political party was actually a middle class experiment and a middle class apuesta, right? So in the book itself, you're talking about electoral politics. So thanks everybody, our time is up. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you.
You know, I'm a huge
everyone.
fan of your work, and I cannot recommend it more. People here, you can see all my post-its. It's a very abigarrado, meaning a very dense and very rich book. So if you want to learn more about it, just go get it. And thank you so much, Ricardo, and everybody else for being here. This was a wonderful talk, a lot of things to think about and to continue talking about in the future. So we hope that we can do that again at some point for you next project, which we didn't talk about what it was, but let that be an excuse to invite you again.
Oh,
so
thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.